How can an autistic person go their whole lives without knowing they're autistic?
It's easy. You only know what you know and who you are seems normal to you because you've never been anyone else.
In addition to what others have said, autism also tends to run in the family. I personally was diagnosed as an adult. It is patently obvious to me that my father is autistic. He is 60 years old. Of course I wasn't diagnosed as a child because anytime anyone mentioned my difficulties with things, my father would say that's normal and leave it at that. Also, the first person who was ever diagnosed with autism is still alive. It's a relatively recent categorization. My grandmother even brags about having had my dad tested when he was 12 because he couldn't tie his shoes and how the doctor said he's not retarded, he's actually extremely intelligent and nothing else was done. Because it was the 70s in rural Brazil and that was all the testing that existed then. Not all symptoms of autism are so obvious. Especially if they are high functioning. It's similar to when adults don't know they have conditions like ADHD. Children typically only get tested if they aren't talking, or are struggling in school. If you're a verbal child with decent grades, then no one will refer the child for testing.
Because it's a whole spectrum, and if they aren't diagnosed as a child, they probably have a whole host of coping mechanisms that at least work so they can function in the rest of society. And since talking about one's inner processes is rarely encouraged in causal conversation, they might not even realize that most people don't need a host of coping mechanisms, as most people assume that their experiences are normal until shown otherwise. A fine example of the last bit is Sid versus Stand Wipers. Both are flabbergasted to learn the other exists and can scarcely imagine how that even works.
So if someone's autism isn't particularly problematic and they make it through childhood without a diagnosis, there's a good chance that they could go the entire rest of their lives just being the person who has house crammed full of strawberry-themed decorations or a $50,000 model train set up in their basement instead.
Autism often runs in families. Parents might not notice because their child seems normal to them.
I didn't know I was autistic until I was in my 30s. I just kept to myself to avoid misunderstandings and arguments, etc. My life didn't change much once I knew. I still avoid people in general.
A lot of people in this thread have given fantastic reasons and shared their journey of discovering they were autistic, a lot of which heavily mirror my own journey of being diagnosed as a 36-year-old woman. But I did want to share a little part of my diagnosis that stuck out to me. The psychiatrist who diagnosed me as likely autistic made it clear that she didn't believe I was on the spectrum from the moment she met me. Despite knowing absolutely nothing about me, one of her disbelieving questions during our initial meeting was, "Didn't anybody ever notice?" Quote, I was too flustered to answer her correctly. But the answer is, yes. Everybody noticed that I was different. My entire life. They just never put all the pieces together to form the picture of autism. Instead, it was more like my parents noticed how physically uncoordinated I was. And how I hated having crumbs of anything touch my fingers. And my peers in elementary school noticed how I always wore the same clothes over and over and over again. And my grandma noticed how obsessed I was with writing in my diary up to 5x per day. And my second and third grade teachers noticed how obsessed I was with reading. And my middle school peers noticed how I didn't understand when they were making fun of me. And my middle school teachers noticed how intelligent but shy I was. And my sister noticed how much extra alone time I needed in my room after socializing. And my high school friends noticed how I eat my food in such painstakingly particular order. And my employers noticed that I always had 100 clarifying questions on any instruction I was given. And my adult friends noticed that I wore flip-flops in the snow because socks are a sensory nightmare. And little kids around me noticed how much I have in common with them, so we always got along swimmingly, and etc.
So on and so forth for almost every aspect of my life. Everyone notices something about me that, when glanced over, could just look like a strange little quirk. It's only when you start actually looking at all of the strange little quirks together that the picture becomes a bit more clear.
How would you know your brain is different? You can only experience yourself.
Because a lot of the symptoms widely known are based on male children. Autism can look very different in adults and especially women. A lot of autistic traits are passed off as personality issues. So people just think they're different but don't know why. Autism is not well represented in the media or entertainment. Also, a lot of people struggle to separate something like autism from intellectual disability. So autistic people often hear, "But you don't seem autistic." It's because autism is portrayed very narrowly and/or confused with intellectual disability. People also just make really hard, so if they seem normal to others, they might not pick up on it if nobody else says anything. Because the more nuanced neurotypical conditions weren't thought of as autism, but simply being sensitive, or moody, or a fuss budget. Only severe autism was really regarded as being a neurological condition. I have quirks that seem autistic, but they're the same quirks as my dad, my mom, my brother, my brother's girlfriend, my ex-wife, and every best friend I've ever had. There's no way everybody in my life could have one underlying undiagnosed mental condition. That's statistically impossible, right? Spoiler alert. Surprise! Everyone's autistic. Autistic people can apparently group together and create enclaves without even knowing it. I had no clue until my doctor emphatically suggested that I be tested. He was right and I was absolutely shocked. But then it all made sense. My parent thought beating me senseless as a kid fixed me being so weird. I was told I have an uncanny ability to mask, but I could barely function around other people and had isolated myself into a corner. Remote jobs, barely left my house, etc. Autism is a spectrum. You probably know plenty of people, including yourself, who have traits which have been associated with autism. For most, they're simply subclinical, not substantial or life-altering enough for a diagnosis. There's no clear threshold for autism, though. There's no instant read autism machine that we can point at your head and go, ding ding. 87%. You're autistic, kid, because there's a level of subjectivity to the diagnosis. And there are a myriad of life circumstances that might push someone toward or away from seeking one in the first place. Not everyone who's autistic is going to realize it. 'Cause I didn't know what the problem was. I only knew there was a thing preventing me and the rest of the world from communicating properly. As it stands, I was diagnosed at 47. It's been an odd life. I didn't realize I was autistic until I was 18. But I sure knew I was weird, annoying, obnoxious, obtuse, stupid, crazy, impossible to teach, and oblivious. And I knew sounds nobody else even seemed to hear bothered me, like certain lights buzzing. But the idea that all this was anything other than a personal, and often moral, failure on my part just wasn't brought up. I highly doubt this experience is unique to me. High functioning and diagnosed in my 30s here. When I was a kid, autism was a thing reserved for characters like Rain Man. Fairly confident my dad would be considered on the spectrum if he were tested too. As someone who was diagnosed 2 years ago at 35, it's complex. I'm level 2. So basically I can function like a normal person with most things, but in other areas I need a huge amount of support. For example, I would work a 5-hour shift in retail and be great at it because I learned at a young age how to mirror people's behavior and voice tone so they feel more comfortable. But when I'd get home I was so overwhelmed that I literally didn't have the brain function left to prepare food or eat. It was instant food and junk, or I'd eat properly if my parents had cooked and kept food aside for me. They'd get irritated and call me lazy, get frustrated that I wasn't working full-time, I'd be criticized because I wasn't social enough outside of work, etc. The reality is, looking back with a better understanding and acceptance of myself, I lived in constant burnout from age 5 to 35. Going to school or work used up my complete mental capacity so that I'd get home and not be able to do the rest of what it means to be human. For decades I was suicidal because my brain was hitting its limits every single day with no reprieve. With everyone in my life telling me how defective I was. Because I was actually defective in ways that I didn't realize. I was treated for depression and anxiety, but nothing worked. I'd actually get worse because it was adding more to my daily chores with no benefit. I'm doing better now knowing how to look after myself. But I still need reminders to treat myself like a human instead of a piece of machinery. TLDR. If you only see in black and white, until someone mentions it and shows you a different option, how do you know there are colors? A lot of knowledge about this wasn't well known up until recently. I was diagnosed in my 40s and it wasn't something anyone was talking about when I was a kid. Some of us get really good at compensating for our weirdness. And just think, of course everyone spends this much energy being normal, because we only know our own POV.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Haircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.